On a Monday morning in November of 2001, at a cargo port construction site on the southern shore of Lake Erie, 7 miles east of downtown Cleveland, a site supervisor named Frank Hollister stood on a frozen breakwall and watched $3 million sink slowly into the lake. 5 days earlier, a barge had been positioning a 140-ton container crane against the new dock when the lake bottom did something nobody had predicted. A sinkhole of old silt left over from the original shipyard demolitions of 1958 gave way beneath the barge's stabilizer pad. The barge tipped 17 degrees. The crane top, heavy and unsecured for the lift, slid off the deck and went into the water with a sound that Frank would remember for the rest of his life. It was not a crash. It was a long, slow groan of steel meeting cold water, followed by a stillness that lasted 4 seconds, and then nothing at all. Now the crane sat half submerged in 18 feet of November water. Its counterweight still visible above the surface, its boom buried 4 feet into the soft lake bottom mud. The recovery company that Apex Heavy Recovery had hired, the biggest in Ohio, had brought their 250-ton hydraulic recovery crane to the site on the second day. They had set up. They had measured. They had pulled. And on the third pull, with the outriggers extended to their full reach, the recovery crane's left rear outrigger pad had begun to sink, 14 inches into the new breakwall fill before they could shut it down. The ground was too soft. The recently poured concrete was too green. The lake bottom near the wall was too unstable. Every solution required getting closer to the water, and every approach toward the water that made the ground less safe. By Friday afternoon, the recovery company had stopped trying. They told Frank they would come back in the spring when the ground had frozen solid. Frank had asked them what spring meant for a construction contract that was already 3 weeks behind. The recovery company supervisor had shrugged the way men shrug when a problem is no longer theirs. The insurance adjuster was coming on Monday to declare the crane a total loss. The Port Authority was preparing to issue a default notice. The general contractor was talking about cutting their losses and walking away from the whole project. Frank stood on the breakwall in a 34-degree wind off the lake and did the math in his head one more time. The crane itself was $520,000. The contract penalty was $18,000 per day, and they were now 11 days behind schedule, which meant $198,000 and counting. The port contract was worth $2.8 million, and if the contract defaulted, the bonding company would take the loss out of the general contractor's pocket. 32 construction workers had been sitting at home for 5 days, drawing partial pay. Frank's own job, his salary of $71,000 a year, his health insurance, his pension contributions, his ability to keep paying child support for 2 teenage sons up in Akron, all of it depended on this one crane coming out of this one lake before this coming Monday morning. Frank had bought a small ranch house on Detroit Avenue in February. The mortgage was $182,000, and he was already a month behind on the second payment because of the divorce settlement. He had not told his sons about the house yet. He had not told them about the divorce either beyond the short conversation in July when he had explained that he and their mother were going to live in different places now, 14 and 16 years old. They still thought he could fix things. He could not at the moment fix a single thing. Now, if you have been around long enough to know what it feels like to stand on a piece of ground at 51 years old and watch the things you spent your life building start to come apart all at once, then you know exactly what kind of cold Frank Hollister was standing in that Monday morning. And it had nothing to do with the wind off Lake Erie. That was when Brad Kessler's black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the construction trailer. Brad Kessler was 42 years old. He had an MBA from Case Western Reserve. He had a wife who worked in pharmaceutical sales, a 4-bedroom house in Westlake, and a Rolex Submariner that he had bought for himself the previous Christmas as a reward for a year of strong revenue growth at Apex Heavy Recovery, the company he had taken over from his father in 1996 and rebranded with new logos, new equipment, and a new philosophy about how heavy recovery should be done in the 21st century. Brad had just been named Innovator of the Year by the Ohio Construction Association at their annual banquet in Columbus 3 weeks before the crane went into the lake. He had a framed certificate on the wall of his office and a copy of the trade magazine with his picture on the cover sitting on his desk. Brad climbed out of the Escalade in a navy peacoat over a gray turtleneck holding a Starbucks cup. Behind him came 2 younger engineers from his Cleveland office, both with clipboards, and a young woman with a video camera. The young woman was filming for the company's new marketing initiative. They were going to call the video Why Modern Wins. Brad had explained the concept to his board of directors the previous Tuesday. The idea was to document in real time how modern recovery methodology and proper engineering thinking solved problems that older approaches could not handle. The lake crane recovery was supposed to be the centerpiece. Brad had been telling people for 3 days that they would have the crane out by Thursday afternoon. It was now the following Monday, and the crane was still in the lake, and the marketing video was about to need a different angle. Brad walked up to Frank with the same broad smile he had walked up with on the first day 6 days ago. He clapped Frank on the shoulder. He said the words, "Frank, my friend, we are going to figure this out." He said them in the same tone a doctor uses when he is about to deliver news he does not want to deliver. Frank did not smile back. Frank looked at the lake, then at Brad, then at the camera the young woman was already filming with. Brad turned to the engineers. He started talking about ground-bearing analysis. He used phrases like load distribution matrix and bearing pressure recalibration. He talked for almost 10 minutes without saying anything Frank could use. The 2 engineers nodded at appropriate intervals. The young woman moved the camera in for closer shots when Brad gestured toward the lake. Frank had been on construction sites since he was 19 years old. He had worked his way up from laborer to foreman to superintendent over 32 years. He knew the difference between a man solving a problem and a man performing the appearance of solving a problem. He knew which one was happening in front of him. He also knew that he could not say so, because Brad Kessler's company had a $400,000 contract with the general contractor, and the general contractor was Frank's employer, and the general contractor's vice president was Brad's golf partner at Mayfield Country Club. So Frank stood and listened. The wind came off the lake and went through his coat as if his coat was not there. That was when Vince Polchek walked over from the equipment trailer. Vince Polchek was 67 years old. He was a Polish-American steelworker's son from the west side of Cleveland, and he had worked construction in Cuyahoga County for 49 years. He had been a foreman at American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain from 1968 until they closed the yards in 1992, after which he had moved into general construction. Vince had hands like cured leather and a face that had not been surprised by anything in 2 decades. He stood at the edge of the conversation for almost a full minute before he spoke. He looked at Frank. He did not look at Brad. Vince said the words quietly in a voice that was not meant for a camera. He said, "Frank, you should call Walter Brennan." Brad turned. Brad asked who Walter Brennan was. Vince did not answer Brad. Vince kept looking at Frank. Frank said the name out loud. Walter Brennan, the way a man tries out a word he has not used in a while. Vince said he lived in Lorain. Vince said his father had built a wrecker in the late 40s from a surplus Mack chassis. Vince said Walter had used it for 30-something years on jobs that nobody else would touch. Vince said it was the kind of truck that could do things modern equipment could not do, in places modern equipment could not reach. Brad laughed. He laughed in a way that was meant to be heard by the entire crew standing within 50 feet of the trailer, and several of them turned around to look. Brad said, "Frank, my friend, please. We are not in 1950 anymore. We do not call retired men with garage-built wreckers when we have a 140-ton crane in a lake. This is not the answer. The answer is the engineering work we are doing right now. The answer is the proper assessment of the load-bearing capacity of the brake wall and the development of a properly distributed lift plan. The answer is patience and methodology, not nostalgia." Brad said the word nostalgia like it was a small disease he had just identified in someone else's child. Vince did not respond to Brad. Vince looked at Frank and waited. Frank looked at Vince. Frank looked at the lake. Frank looked at the recovery crane sitting useless on the brake wall. Its outriggers retracted its engine cold for the third day in a row. Frank looked at the construction trailer, where his coffee was probably still steaming on his desk, next to the divorce paperwork he had been pretending to read at 6 that morning. Frank said, "All right, Vince. Give me the address." Brad's face changed slightly. "Not much, just enough." The young woman with the camera kept filming. "Now, if you have ever been in a moment like that, where a powerful man tells you in front of an audience that you are about to make a terrible mistake, and you make the choice anyway, you know that the cost of that choice does not get paid in the moment. The cost gets paid later in the quiet hours in the kitchen in the dark, when you are alone with the thing you decided." Frank Hollister got into his pickup truck and drove 40 minutes west along the lakeshore toward Lorraine. Walter Brennan's house sat on a quiet street called Sycamore, 3 blocks back from the lake in a neighborhood that had been built for shipyard workers in the late 40s and had been slowly emptying ever since the American Shipbuilding Company closed its Lorraine yards in 1992. The houses were small and brick and well kept by the few residents who remained. Walter's house had a screen porch on the front and a 2.5-car garage on the back, separated from the house by a strip of grass that had been mowed within the last week despite the November chill. Frank parked in the driveway and got out of the truck. He stood for a moment looking at the garage. The garage was nearly as old as the house and considerably more cared for. The siding had been painted in the last 2 years. The roof was new. The doors were the original wooden swing-out type with hand-forged hinges and small windows up high, and a hand-lettered sign above them that read, simply Brennan and Son, no address, no phone number, no advertisement, just a name. Walter was in the side yard. He was on his knees in the brown grass next to a small concrete bench, painting the bench with a brush. Slowly, the way a man paints something that does not need to be painted but is going to be painted anyway. He was wearing a gray work shirt buttoned to the throat and a navy blue cap with a faded fish embroidered on the front. He was 74 years old. His shoulders were narrower than they had been 40 years ago, but his hands were still steady, and his back when he straightened up to look at the truck pulling into the driveway was straighter than the back of any other 74-year-old man Frank had met that year. Frank walked over. He introduced himself. He said his name and his employer, and the name of the construction project, and the name of the bay he was working in, and the name of the recovery company that had failed, and the date the insurance adjuster was coming to declare the crane a total loss. He laid all of it out in less than 90 seconds because he had practiced the speech on the drive over. Walter listened without interrupting. When Frank was done, Walter set the brush down on the lid of the paint can and wiped his hands on a rag he kept in his back pocket. He looked at the concrete bench. He did not look at Frank. Frank waited. Walter said the words slowly, almost without inflection. He said, "My wife is buried in Calvary Cemetery 2 miles east of here. The bench is for her. I sit on it on Sundays." Frank did not know what to say to that. He stood with his hands in his pockets. "Walter said my wife passed in 1997. Lung cancer. She never smoked. She worked at the dry cleaner on Broadway for 31 years and breathed the chemicals every day. And the cancer came in the spring of 1996, and she fought it for 14 months. Before she passed, she asked me to do 2 things. She asked me to keep the garden alive, and she asked me to stop running the truck in cold water." Frank was quiet. "Walter said I had back surgery in 1999, lumbar fusion L4 and L5. The surgeon said no more cold water work. Margaret made me promise. I gave her my word. She has been gone 4 years this April, but a man does not break a word he gave to a woman on her last bed." Frank looked at the concrete bench. He looked at the garage. He looked at his own boots. "Walter said, 'I am sorry about your crane, Mr. Hollister. I truly am. But I cannot help you. I have not started that truck in 22 months. I am 74 years old. Whatever Vince Polchek told you, he told you about the man I used to be. The man I am now is a man who paints a bench for his wife on Mondays and stays out of cold water." Walter picked the brush back up. Frank stood there for almost a full minute. He thought about saying something else. He thought about explaining the math. He thought about telling Walter that his sons were 14 and 16, and that the mortgage on Detroit Avenue was already a month behind, and that the only thing standing between him and a real and permanent kind of failure was a 140-ton crane that nobody could pull out of a lake. He did not say any of it. He said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Brennan." He walked back to his truck and drove away. Walter painted the bench until the November light started to go, which happened around 4:30. He cleaned the brush in mineral spirits, hung it on the small board inside the garage where the brushes lived, closed the paint can and went inside the house to make dinner. Dinner was a can of Campbell's tomato soup and 4 saltine crackers and a slice of cheddar cheese. He ate it at the kitchen table by the window that looked out at the garage. Margaret's chair across from him had not been sat in by anyone in 4.5 years. He still set her place. He had stopped putting food on her plate after the first year, but he had never stopped putting the plate out. He washed the dish. He went into the living room. He sat in the chair by the radio and listened to the 7 o'clock news on WTAM. There was a story about the construction site. Frank Hollister's name was not mentioned, but the lake was, and the crane was, and the figure $2.8 million was, and the words insurance loss were. Walter turned the radio off. He sat in the chair in the dark and looked at the wall. Now, if you have ever sat in a chair in the dark at 74 years old and felt the weight of a promise you made to a woman who was not there anymore, then you know that sometimes the kindest thing a memory can do is stay quiet and let you sleep. And sometimes the memory does not do you that kindness. Sometimes the memory walks across the room and sits down across from you and waits for you to look at it. At 9:15, Walter Brennan got up and went out to the garage. He turned on the bare bulb that hung from the ceiling beam. The light fell across the truck under its gray canvas tarp. He stood and looked at it for a long time. The garage had been built by his father, Eli Brennan, in the spring of 1947. In the same months that Eli had been buying the surplus Mack chassis from the Army Quartermaster Depot in Lima, Ohio. Eli had bought the chassis for $412 on the 11th of April, 1947. Walter remembered the date because he had been with his father that day. Walter had just turned 20. He had come back from the Pacific in October of 1946, 18 months in the Navy. 2 of those months on a destroyer escort in the waters off Okinawa, and he had been working at American Shipbuilding since the previous Christmas, learning to weld in the same hull division where his father had welded since 1932. The day they bought the chassis, Eli had driven the rented flatbed home with the chassis on it, and Walter had ridden in the passenger seat, and his father had said almost to himself the words that Walter had remembered every day since. His father had said, "Every man who knows how to weld owes the world a thing he made for nothing." Walter had not understood what his father meant at the time. He had been 20 years old, and he had been thinking mostly about a girl named Margaret Connolly, who worked at the dry cleaner on Broadway, and who had agreed to go to a movie with him the following Saturday. He had nodded at his father and looked out the window at the gray Ohio sky, and the chassis had bounced and rattled behind them, and the conversation had ended. Eli had spent the next 2 years building the truck. He had welded the cantilever boom from I-beams pulled out of a demolition pile at the shipyard sections of structural steel that had been part of a 1922 hull framing the Navy had condemned. He had built the winch drum himself, fabricated the gear reduction from parts he scavenged out of 3 different, obsolete shipyard cranes machined the bearings on a lathe. He kept in the back of the garage. He had done most of the welding at night after his shift, sometimes with Walter holding the work light, sometimes alone. He had not borrowed $1 to build it. He had not bought a part new if he could find it used. The total cash he had put into the truck by Walter's count when Eli had finally finished in the summer of 1949 had been $84. $84 and 2 years of nights. Walter walked across the garage now in the dim light and put his hand on the tarp. He could feel the shape of the boom underneath the long vertical rise of it, the way it angled forward at the top. He had not pulled the tarp off the truck in 22 months. He pulled it off now. The Mack LMSW sat on the concrete floor of the garage, exactly as Eli had built it, exactly as Walter had maintained it for 52 years. The original army green paint had been gone for decades, replaced with the dark blue Eli had liked. The cab was square and high with a flat windshield divided into 2 panels and a hood that came up to Walter's chest. The Mack EN4 01 gasoline engine sat under that hood. 707 cubic inches. 6 cylinders designed in 1939 for military hauling. The transmission behind it was a Mack quadruplex, 4-speed with a 2-speed auxiliary giving 8 forward gears and a total reduction in the lowest gear of 64-1, which meant the truck could pull at almost any speed down to a slow walking crawl. The winch sat behind the cab mechanical drum driven no hydraulics anywhere on the truck. Eli had not trusted hydraulics. He had said hydraulics were a man's way of telling his engine to lie to him. The cantilever boom rose 26 feet into the air above the bed of the truck, painted the same dark blue with the hand-welded joints visible at every connection. The welds slightly uneven the way only a man's hand can weld in 1948 in a Lorraine garage at midnight. Walter stood and looked at the truck. He opened the driver's door. He climbed up. The driver's seat was the original 1947 seat recovered 3 times the most recent time in 1989 by Margaret, who had done the upholstery herself on the sewing machine in the back bedroom. He sat in the seat. He put his hands on the wheel. The wheel was cold. The cab smelled the way it had always smelled: oil and old leather, and a faint trace of the pine tar. Eli had used on the brake bands. Walter sat for a long time. He got out of the cab. He walked to the workbench at the back of the garage. He opened the top drawer. He took out the leather-bound notebook his father had kept, the one that had 32 years of recovery jobs written in it, in Eli's small, careful handwriting. He carried it back to the cab. He sat in the driver's seat with the notebook open on his lap and turned to the page marked March 14th, 1965. He read what his father had written there. Hollister boy. Truck through ice off Beaver Park. Refrigerated unit 3/4 ton. Pulled with boom set at 22 degrees 3 line rig anchored to the seawall east pillar. Pull took 4 hours. Boy was scared. Father had fought in the Pacific, same as me. Boy said he could not pay. I told him I did not want to be paid. Wrote his name down so I would remember. Stanley Hollister, age 22 of Lakewood. Said he would buy me a beer someday. Never did. That is how it should be. Walter read the entry 3 times. Stanley Hollister. He read the name again. He spoke it aloud in the quiet of the cab. Stanley Hollister. He sat with the notebook open on his lap. He looked out through the windshield at the back wall of the garage, where Eli's hand tools still hung on the same nails Eli had driven into the wall in 1947. Walter said his father's name aloud in the dim cab, the way a man speaks the name of someone who has been dead a long time when he is by himself and needs to say it. He said, Pa. He said, Pa, the man's son is in trouble. The garage was very quiet. Walter closed the notebook. He carried it back to the workbench drawer. He turned off the light. He went into the house. He sat in the chair by the telephone in the kitchen. He looked at the phone for almost 20 minutes. Then he picked it up, dialed his son David's number in Columbus, and listened to it ring 4 times before David answered. David Brennan was 45 years old. He was a mechanical engineer at a company in Worthington that made hydraulic systems for industrial automation. He was Walter's only son. He had 3 children of his own, and a wife named Linda who taught 4th grade. He had not been home to Lorraine since Margaret's funeral. David said, Pa, what is wrong? It is almost 10 o'clock. Walter said, Son, I need you to tell me something. David said, What? Walter said, If a man asked your grandfather for help 50 years ago, and your grandfather helped him without taking a dime, and now that man's son needs help and the same machine is sitting in the garage, what do you think your grandfather would say? There was a long silence on the line. David did not ask any of the obvious questions. He did not ask what man or what machine or what help. He had grown up in the house. He knew the answer to all of those questions before his father finished the sentence. David said, Pa. Walter waited. David said, You promised, Ma. Walter said, I know what I promised your mother. David said, You promised her after the surgery. You promised her in the hospital. Walter said, I know where I promised her son. I was there. I remember the room. I remember the chair. There was another silence. David said, What kind of recovery is it? Walter said, 140-ton crane in 18 feet of water off the Newport construction east of downtown. They have been trying for 5 days. Apex Recovery is on it, and they cannot get close enough. The ground is too soft. David said, Pa, that is cold water work. Walter said, I know. David said, That is exactly what Ma made you promise not to do. Walter said, I know. There was a third silence, longer than the first 2. Walter could hear his son breathing on the other end of the line 400 miles south. in a house he had never seen with 3 grandchildren asleep upstairs that Walter had not held since the youngest was a baby. David said the words very softly. He said, "Pa, what would Grandpa Eli say?" Walter closed his eyes. Walter said, "Your grandfather would say I have to go." David said, "Then go, Pa." Walter said, "Son, I need you here. I cannot rig that truck alone. Not at my age. Not for 140-ton pull. I need someone on the ground with me who knows what he is looking at." David said, "When?" Walter said 6 in the morning. David said, "I am leaving Columbus at 3. Walter said, "Son, you have a job tomorrow." David said, "Pa, I have taken exactly 4 sick days in 11 years. I have a job tomorrow that will still be there on Wednesday. Grandpa Eli will not be there on Wednesday. I will see you at 6. The line went dead. Walter sat in the kitchen chair with the receiver still in his hand for a moment. Then he set it back in the cradle. He went to bed at 10:30 and lay awake until almost 2. When he finally slept, he dreamed of his father walking across the floor of the shipyard in the summer of 1948, carrying a section of I-beam in his bare hands. The steel still warm from the cutting torch, his face wet with sweat, his eyes calm. At 5:30 in the morning, Walter got up, made coffee in the percolator Margaret had bought in 1978, drank 1 cup standing at the window, dressed in heavy work clothes, 2 pairs of socks, his old steel toe boots, his canvas barn coat with the lining sewn in by Margaret in 1985, and walked out to the garage. He started the Mac at 5:57. The engine turned over on the 3rd try. It coughed once, twice, then caught with the deep, heavy idle of a 1939 design military gasoline engine that had been built when men understood that an engine was a thing you wanted to be able to hear from 100 yards away. The cab filled with the smell of cold combustion and pine tar and old oil. David's pickup pulled into the driveway at 6:04. David Brennan got out, walked over to the garage, looked at his father, sitting in the cab of the Mac, looked at the truck he had not seen running in 7 years, and said only Pa. Walter said son. David climbed into the passenger seat. Walter put the truck in gear. The Mac rolled out of the garage onto Sycamore Street at 6:07 in the morning with the November sky still dark above the houses, and turned east toward Cleveland. Now let me tell you what Walter Brennan did not yet know. That Tuesday morning, as he drove his father's 1947 Mac along Lake Road toward the construction site east of downtown, he did not know that Brad Kessler had spent the previous evening at the Mayfield Country Club bar, telling the general contractor's vice president that the only way to resolve the crane situation was for the general contractor to authorize an additional $180,000 for a specialized salvage operation involving cofferdams divers and a 6-week timeline. He did not know that the young woman with the video camera had already drafted the script for the marketing video. Brad wanted a script that ended with the words, "This is what modern recovery looks like," and that the script was scheduled to be filmed on Friday afternoon regardless of whether the crane had come out of the lake by then. He did not know that Vince Polchek had told 3 other men at the construction site before going home Monday evening that Walter Brennan was coming, and that those 3 men had told their wives that night, and that one of them had a son named Jake, whose grandfather had been pulled out of a snowdrift on Route 6 in February of 1971 by a Mack wrecker with a hand-welded boom, and that Jake had decided sitting at his kitchen table after his father told him the story that he was going to be at the construction site at 6 in the morning whether anyone asked him to be there or not, too. He did not know that the breakwall the recovery crane had failed on was built directly above the original 1922 foundation of the American shipbuilding Lorraine No. 3 slipway, and that the foundation was still there 12 feet down under the new fill intact solid, capable of bearing any load a man could reasonably ask of it. He did not know that his father, Eli Brennan, had been one of the welders who had poured that foundation in 1922. He did not know that the cantilever boom on the truck he was driving had been designed by Eli to use that foundation as its primary anchor point, 54 years before Walter would arrive at the lake and figure it out. Walter did not know any of that. He just drove east toward Cleveland with his son in the passenger seat and his father's notebook in the glove box and a 140-ton crane waiting in the lake for a piece of 1947 steel that nobody at the construction site except an old Polish foreman named Vince Polchek and a 51-year-old man named Frank Hollister believed could do the job. The sun came up over Lake Erie behind them as they drove. The water was the color of an old nickel. The Mack rolled east along Lake Road at a steady 28 miles per hour, the only speed Walter had ever felt comfortable driving it. David sat in the passenger seat with his hands flat on his knees, looking out the side window at the lake. They did not talk for the first 8 miles. There was nothing to say that needed to be said in the dark before sunrise. The engine spoke for them, its deep 6-cylinder thrum filling the cab the way a fire fills a room. When they passed the Lorraine city limits, David finally turned and looked at his father. He said, "Pa, when was the last time you pulled something heavier than 50 tons? Walter said 1984. The barge cable spool at Conneaut Harbor. 62 tons. David said that was 17 years ago. Walter said, I know when it was." David did not say anything else. They came into the construction site at 6:41. The sun was just beginning to lift over the lake behind them, and the long horizontal light caught the side of the Mack and the cantilever boom as they rolled through the open gate. Every man on the site stopped what he was doing. There were 11 workers at the site that morning, more than the usual skeleton crew Frank had been running for the past 5 days. Vince Polchek was there. Frank Hollister was there. A foreman named Carl Hewitt was there. And a younger ironworker named Jake Mooney was there, 27 years old, sitting on the tailgate of his Ford Ranger pickup with a thermos of coffee, watching the gate. Jake Mooney's grandfather had been pulled out of a snowdrift on Route 6 in February of 1971 by a Mack wrecker with a hand-welded boom. Jake's grandfather had told him the story exactly twice in his life, once when Jake was 9 years old, and once at the grandfather's 80th birthday party in 1998. Jake had not thought about the story in over 2 years. Then his father had called him the previous evening and told him what Vince Polchek had said at the construction site, and the story had come back to Jake fully formed, every detail of it, and he had decided to be at the gate at sunrise. Brad Kessler's black Escalade was already parked at the trailer. Brad was standing outside it with his peacoat unbuttoned and a fresh Starbucks cup in his hand, talking to the 2 engineers and the young woman with the camera. When the Mack rolled past the trailer, Brad turned and looked, and his face went through a series of expressions that he tried to control and could not entirely manage. He looked at the truck. He looked at the boom. He looked at the 74-year-old man at the wheel. He laughed, but the laugh came out a half-second later than he meant it to, and a half-second too quiet. Walter parked the Mack on the gravel apron 40 feet back from the brake wall. He shut the engine off. The silence after the engine died was very large. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he climbed down from the cab slowly, the way a 74-year-old man climbs down from a 1947 truck cab in November. David came around from the passenger side Frank Hollister walked up. He shook Walter's hand and did not say anything beyond Mr. Brennan. "Thank you for coming." Walter said, "Son, I have not said yes yet. I came to look." He walked past Frank toward the breakwall. Now, if you have ever watched a man with 50 years of trade in his hands walk onto a job site, you know what it looks like, and you know how little of it has anything to do with the words he says. Walter did not speak to anyone for the next 40 minutes. He walked the length of the breakwall slowly west to east and back again, stopping every 15 feet to push a steel survey rod into the ground at his feet. The rod was a 4-foot length of half-inch round stock he had brought from the truck, tapered at one end. He drove it down into the new fill with the heel of his hand and read the depth on the marked shaft. Then he pulled it out, walked another 15 feet, drove it again. He did not look at the lake. He did not look at the crane. He looked at the ground. When he reached the east end of the breakwall, where the new fill met the older shoreline at a low concrete retaining wall, he stopped. He stood there for a long time, perhaps 2 full minutes. He pushed the rod into the ground at his feet and felt it stop after only 7 inches. He pulled the rod out and pushed it down again 6 feet to the west of the first hole. It stopped at 7 inches again. He walked west along the breakwall, pushing the rod at every step, now his face very still. 12 feet from the retaining wall, the rod went down a full 4 feet before stopping. 14 feet from the wall, the rod went down 5 feet and was still moving when he stopped pushing. He had found it. He walked back to the east end of the breakwall. He stood directly above the spot where the rod had stopped at 7 inches. He turned his body and faced the lake. He sighted along an imaginary line from where he was standing out to the half-submerged crane in the water. He held his hand up at arm's length, thumb extended the way an old draftsman estimates an angle. He turned and walked back toward the Mac. David was waiting at the truck. Frank was standing 10 feet behind David. Brad Kessler was standing at the trailer 30 yards back, watching with the camera running. Vince Polchek had walked over and was leaning against the front fender of the Mac with his arms crossed. Walter said to David the old shipyard slip foundation is still down there. David said what? Walter said number 3 slip. Pa welded the rebar in 1922. They condemned the slipway in 1958. And they tore down the upper structure, but they left the foundation poor. 12 feet of reinforced concrete, 50 feet wide, 90 feet long. It is sitting 12 feet under the new fill at the east end of this breakwall. The recovery crane has been trying to anchor west of it, where the fill is over open lake bottom. Of course it sinks. There is nothing under it for 40 feet down. David looked at the east end of the breakwall. He looked at his father. He said, "Pa, how do you know?" Walter said, "I know because I helped Pa survey for the boom geometry on this truck in 1948. He designed the boom angle to anchor against this exact foundation. He measured it twice. He told me he was building the truck to work this lake." David did not say anything. Walter said, "Your grandfather knew this day was coming. He just did not know which day it was gonna be." Vince Polchek heard him. Vince did not move from where he was leaning against the fender. Vince said quietly, "Your father was a hell of a man, Walter." Walter said, "Yes, he was." Frank Hollister was looking from one man to the other and trying to follow. Walter turned to Frank. He said, "Mr. Hollister, here is what I can do, and here is what I cannot do. I can position this truck on the east end of your breakwall directly above the old slip foundation. I can rig a 4-part purchase off the boom and run the lead line out to the crane on the bottom. I can use this truck's frame and the boom geometry to pull the crane through the mud and onto the breakwall over the course of about 3 hours working from the foundation as my anchor instead of trying to anchor on new fill. What I cannot do is promise you it will work. The boom is 52 years old. The winch is 52 years old. The crane is 20 times the weight of this truck. If anything fails, it fails all at once, and I cannot guarantee that the truck itself will not be destroyed in the process. I have to know if you accept that risk before I unhook this rig. Frank looked at the lake. He looked at the crane sitting in the water. He looked at Brad Kessler standing at the trailer. He said, "Mr. Brennan, my truck has a $50,000 policy on it through my employer. If your truck is damaged, my company will make it good." Walter said, "Son, that is not the risk I am talking about. The boom is not for sale. The truck is not for replacement. My father made it with his hands. If it is destroyed, it does not get rebuilt. I am asking if you understand that." Frank was quiet. He said, "Mr. Brennan, I understand." Walter nodded once. He said, "All right. Let us get to work." The rigging took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Walter did not rush it. He had David position the Mac at the east end of the breakwall, exactly over the spot where the survey rod had stopped at 7 inches, exactly where Eli Brennan had drawn a small X on a sheet of wax paper in the summer of 1948. Walter pulled the waxed paper drawing from the leather notebook and showed it to David. The drawing was a hand-sketched plan of the original number 3 slipway, with the foundation outline in pencil, and 3 small X marks at the east center and west anchor points. Eli had labeled the east X with the words primary anchor. He had labeled the center X with the words secondary anchor heavy. He had labeled the west X with 3 words last resort only. David held the waxed paper in his hands and looked at it for a long time before handing it back to his father. He said, "Pa." Walter said, "I know. They work." Walter set the Mac's parking brake and dropped 4 cribbing blocks under the frame rails, oak timbers 10 inches square, that Eli had cut in 1949 from a fallen tree in his uncle's woodlot. Walter ran a 1¼ inch steel cable from the winch drum up through the head sheave at the top of the cantilever boom, then down through a heavy snatch block anchored at the base of the boom, then out across the breakwall on a long, shallow angle toward the lake. The cable ran through a second snatch block, anchored to a concrete retaining post at the water's edge, then down into the water at a 12-degree angle, where David had set the hook position on a temporary float, so they could find the rigging point when Walter waded out. That was when Walter put on the chest waders. Margaret had made him promise. He stood in the cab of the truck and pulled on the heavy rubber waders over his work pants and boots, slowly, the way an old man pulls on clothing that does not fit him quite the same as it used to. He buckled the straps over his shoulders. He pulled on a second canvas coat over the waders. He pulled a wool watch cap down over his ears. David watched him. David said, "Pa." Walter said, "Son, I know what your mother asked." David said, "I am not going to argue with you." Walter said, "Good." He climbed down from the cab. He walked to the edge of the breakwall and looked down at the water. The lake was 34 degrees. The breakwall dropped 4 feet to the surface. The crane was 46 feet out from where he was standing, half submerged in 18 feet of water and 4 feet of mud. He stepped down onto the small steel ladder Frank's crew had welded to the breakwall the previous week, and he descended into the lake. Now, if you have ever stepped into a great lake in the second week of November, at the age of 74, with a promise to a dead wife burning under the canvas of your coat, you know that there are only two prayers a man says in that moment. One is for forgiveness. The other is for time. Walter said both of them silently as the water came over the tops of his boots and rose up to his thighs. The current at the breakwall was not as strong as the open lake, but the cold went through the waders within 90 seconds. Walter kept moving. He waded along the cable line toward the float, the cable trailing over his shoulder, the lead hook at the end. The water came up to his chest by the 12th step. By the 18th step, he could see the top of the crane's counterweight breaking the surface 10 feet ahead. He reached the crane. He hooked the lead cable to the heavy ring on the upper carrier frame. The structural attachment point Eli had identified on the waxed paper sketch 53 years before he had ever seen this particular crane. The hook closed with a steel click that Walter felt through his glove more than he heard. He waded back to the breakwall. He climbed the ladder. His legs were shaking by the time he reached the top, and he stopped for a moment with his hands on the rail to make them stop. David stepped forward to help him out of the waders. Walter led him. Frank Hollister handed Walter a thermos of coffee. Walter did not drink it. He nodded once at Frank and walked back to the Mac and climbed into the cab. The time was 11:47 in the morning. Brad Kessler had been on his cell phone for the last half hour, walking back and forth in front of his Escalade. The young woman with the camera had moved into position about 60 feet from the Mac. The two engineers were standing at the trailer steps, watching with their clipboards lowered. Walter sat in the cab. He set both hands on the wheel. He let out a long breath that fogged the inside of the windshield. He engaged the winch. The cable went taut. For 90 seconds, nothing in the visible world changed. The drum on the back of the Mac turned slowly under 64 to 1-gear reduction. The cable hummed at a low frequency. The boom above the cab creaked. Once, then settled. The crane in the water did not move. Then the left rear wheel of the Mac lifted 4 inches off the cribbing. Frank Hollister said something quietly to himself that nobody else heard. Brad Kessler turned to the camera. He raised his voice to make sure it carried. He said, "There it is. Physics wins. Tell the old man to go home." He laughed, and this time, the laugh came at the right time and the right volume. And the two engineers laughed with him, and the young woman with the camera moved in closer to catch Brad's face. Walter shut the winch down. He set the brake. He climbed out of the cab. He walked around the truck slowly, looking at each wheel, each cribbing block. The boom mast, the frame extensions Eli had welded in 1948. He stopped at the left rear and looked at the cribbing. The block was sound. The frame was sound. The lift had been clean. The truck was telling him something, but it wasn't telling him that it was failing. It was telling him that the angle was wrong. He walked to the front of the Mac and stood looking out at the lake. He understood the problem now. The crane's boom was buried 4 feet into the mud at a near vertical attitude, and a horizontal pull from the breakwall was trying to drag the entire mass of the crane sideways through 46 feet of mud and water against the suction of the buried boom. It would not work. The crane needed to come up first just a few inches, just enough to break the suction on the buried boom. The pull had to be upward and forward, not horizontal, which meant the Mac needed to be set further west on the breakwall, where the boom could pull at a steeper angle. But the further west the Mac went, the further it moved from the old slip foundation, which meant the anchor was weaker. There was one position that would work. Eli had marked it on the waxed paper. Last resort only. Walter walked back to the Mac. He climbed into the cab. He took the truck out of gear, released the brake, and rolled the Mac forward 18 feet along the breakwall. then turned the wheel and brought the rear of the truck around, so the boom was now positioned over the center line of the old foundation. The heavy center anchor exactly where Eli had drawn the second X in pencil in 1948. He set the brake. He dropped the cribbing again slower this time. He had David check each block. He started to put the truck back into low gear. That was when the transmission made a sound the truck had never made before. It was a single deep mechanical thunk from the case behind the cab. It was not the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a gear tooth giving way under load. Walter heard it. He knew it before he had time to think about it. He put his foot on the clutch and held it down. He moved the gear lever through the pattern. Low to second to third to fourth. Third gear was gone. The lever moved through the position with no resistance, no engagement. The gear tooth was lying in the bottom of the case in 3 pieces. Walter shut the engine off. He sat in the cab with his hands on the wheel for almost a full minute. David came around from the back of the truck. He stepped up to the cab door. He said, "Pa." Walter said, "Son, the third gear pinion just sheared." David said, "Can you pull in second?" Walter said, "No. The reduction is wrong. I cannot move 140 tons in second. I need third. Third is the pull gear. Third is the gear Pa designed the reduction around." David did not say anything. Walter climbed down from the cab. He walked to the back of the truck and stood looking at the side cover of the transmission case. He set one hand on the cold steel. He let it stay there. Brad Kessler had walked over from the trailer. He stood at a distance of about 20 feet, with the camera operator behind him and the 2 engineers behind her. He had stopped laughing. He was watching now with a different expression, an expression that was something close to satisfaction, but holding itself still. Brad said, "Mr. Brennan, is everything all right?" Walter did not answer him. Walter did not turn around. Brad said, "It is a beautiful old truck. It is a real shame." Walter sat down on the cribbing block at the rear of the Mac. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he looked at the gravel of the construction apron between his boots. He was 74 years old. He had not slept more than 4 hours. He had broken a promise to his wife. He had taken a 52-year-old truck his father had built with $84 and 2 years of nights, and he had stood it on the edge of a lake and asked it to do something it had never been asked to do before, and he had broken it inside of 4 hours. He sat on the cribbing block, and he could not in that moment make himself stand up again. David stood 10 feet away and did not move. Vince Polchek was leaning against the front fender of the Mac. Frank Hollister was standing near the trailer steps. Jake Mooney was sitting on the tailgate of his Ranger at the gate 50 yards away drinking coffee that had gone cold. Now, if you have ever sat on a piece of equipment your father built and felt the weight of his work go quiet in your hands, then you know exactly how long that moment lasted in Walter Brennan's chest. It lasted longer than a minute. It lasted longer than 5 minutes. What broke the moment was David. David walked over to where his father was sitting. He stood for a few seconds. Then he crouched down on his heels in front of Walter, close enough that their knees almost touched. He said, "Pa, get up." Walter said, "I broke it." David said, "Pa, get up and walk to my truck." Walter looked at him. David said, "In the bed of my truck under the cap." In a green wooden crate, there are 2 replacement third gear pinion sets for a 1947 Mac L MSW quadruplex transmission, machined to factory tolerance by a shop in Akron in 1973. Grandpa Eli ordered 4 of them in 1972. He used the first one in '74 when the original gear cracked. He used the second one in 1986. There are 2 left. They have been in the workbench drawer in your garage for 15 years. I packed them into my truck at 3 this morning before I drove up. I did not say anything because I did not want to look like I doubted the truck. I never doubted the truck, Pa. I doubted the schedule. So get up and walk to my truck. Walter looked at his son for a long time. He did not say anything. He stood up. He walked to David's pickup. The green wooden crate was under the fiberglass cap, exactly where David had said. Inside the crate, wrapped in oiled cloth that Eli Brennan had cut from an old army blanket in 1972, sat 2 pinion gear sets and the matching idler shaft assemblies, every tooth on every gear still bright, with the original Cosmoline preservative Eli had brushed onto them 29 years before. Walter lifted one of the gear sets out of the crate. He held it in both hands. The weight of it was familiar. The weight of it was exactly the weight of what his father had asked him to remember. He carried it back to the Mac. David and Walter spent the next 2 hours and 10 minutes replacing the 3rd gear pinion in the Mac's transmission. They worked under the rear of the truck on creepers by the light of David's handheld flood lamp and a second utility light that Vince Polchek had run from the equipment trailer. They removed the side cover. They drained the gear oil into a galvanized pail. They removed the broken pinion in 3 pieces. They cleaned the case with shop rags and kerosene. They set the new pinion on the shaft, aligned the idler, checked the backlash with a brass feeler gauge that Eli had given Walter for Walter's 25th birthday in 1952. They replaced the side cover. They refilled the case with 80-weight gear oil from a fresh quart bottle David had also brought. While they worked, the construction site went quiet around them. Brad Kessler made one more phone call from his Escalade, then got into the Escalade and drove off the site. He came back 40 minutes later with a thin man in a hard hat and a clipboard, whom Brad introduced to Frank Hollister as a safety consultant from a firm Apex had on retainer. The safety consultant walked the break wall with Brad for 10 minutes, then walked over to Frank and informed him that under the OSHA General Duty Clause in the dew point forecast for that evening, all sight lighting on the break wall apron would need to be shut down at 7:05 p.m. due to the elevated risk of arc flash from energized circuits in close proximity to standing lake water during a falling temperature inversion. Frank looked at the safety consultant. Frank looked at Brad standing behind him. Frank said, "That is not a normal protocol." The safety consultant said, "Sir, it is the protocol my firm is comfortable signing off on. If you elect to operate the sight lights past 19:05 hours, my firm will have to file an incident anticipation report with OSHA Region 5 out of Chicago by morning. That is your decision to make. I am only here to advise." Brad said, "Frank, I am sorry. Safety first, even if it costs us the crane." Brad said the words with the small, careful sadness of a man performing his own decency for the benefit of a camera that was in fact still filming. Frank said nothing. He turned and walked back to where Walter and David were finishing the transmission repair. He did not tell Walter about the lights yet. He waited until Walter slid out from under the truck at 6:23 in the evening with his hands black with grease and his face drawn tight with cold and exhaustion. And only then, when Walter had stood up and stretched his back and washed his hands at the water cooler outside the trailer, did Frank Hollister tell Walter that the construction site lights would be going dark in 42 minutes. Walter listened. He did not say anything for a long moment. He said, "All right." He said, "Son, we have 42 minutes to do a 3-hour pull." David said, "Pa, Walter said we will do what we can do. He walked back to the Mac. He climbed up onto the bed of the truck and inspected the boom rigging one more time. Every shackle, every snatch block, every wrap of cable on the drum. He climbed back down. He climbed into the cab. He started the engine. The Mac EN401 settled into its idle the way it had every morning of Walter's life since 1949. The way the engines of that generation idled when they had been built by men who understood that a thing built right would still be running when the men who built it were gone. David stood at the door of the cab. Walter said, "Son, when I start the pull, I want you back at the trailer with Mr. Hollister. If this truck comes apart, I do not want you near it." David said, "Pa." Walter said, "Son, go to the trailer." David did not move. Walter said, "Son." David said, "No, Pa." Walter looked at him. David said, "I am not going to the trailer. I am standing here at the door of this cab." Grandpa Eli stood at the door of this cab for 30 years while you ran it. You stood at the door of his cab for the 20 years before that. Brennan and Son. That is what the sign over the garage says. If this truck comes apart, it comes apart with both of us standing where we belong. Walter did not argue. He set his hand on the gear lever. He put the Mac into the new third gear at 6:58. The cable came taut at 6:59. At 7:01, the first of the construction site lights went out. At 7:02, the second bank of lights went out. At 7:03, the brake wall went dark. Walter could not see the lake. He could not see the crane. He could see faintly the outline of the cantilever boom against a sky that had not yet finished turning black. He could feel the cable through the seat of the truck. He could feel the tension in the frame rails through the steering column. He had run this truck blind in snow and fog and night more times than he could count, but he had never run it blind on a 140-ton pull. He held the throttle at 1200 RPM and waited. The cable hummed. 40 feet behind him at the trailer, Brad Kessler stood with the two engineers and the safety consultant and the young woman with the camera, watching in the dark. The crane in the water did not move. The boom did not move. The Mac frame creaked once. And then, very quietly, from the gate 50 yards away, the headlights of Jake Mooney's Ford Ranger came on. 2 yellow beams cut through the dark and lit up the back of the Mac. A second later, from somewhere along the apron, a second set of headlights came on. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within 90 seconds, 11 pickup trucks and 1 panel van had moved into position in a slow, shallow arc behind and beside the Mac, and 22 headlights and 4 work lamps and 1 mounted spotlight on Vince Polchek's old Chevy were burning into the November dark, lighting the brake wall, the boom, the cable line, the water beyond, and the half-submerged crane. Walter Brennan, sitting in the cab of his father's truck with his hands on the wheel, looked into the rearview mirror and saw what no man had ever seen behind that truck. In 52 years of work, he saw 11 men who had not been asked to come standing beside their own vehicles in the cold with the engines running and the high beams on. He set his hands more firmly on the wheel. He held the throttle steady at 1200. He looked forward at the lake. The cantilever boom Eli Brennan had welded in the summer of 1948 rose 26 feet into the air above the bed of the truck, and the cable that ran from its head, sheaved down to the buried crane in the lake, hummed at a pitch that was almost too low to hear. Brad Kessler stood at the trailer. He did not say anything. The young woman with the camera kept filming. And in the dark above the gravel apron with 22 headlights burning behind him and his son standing at the open cab door, Walter Brennan waited for the lake to give the crane back. The cable hummed at a pitch that climbed slowly, the way a kettle climbs toward boiling. Walter Brennan sat with his right hand on the throttle lever and his left hand on the wheel and his foot resting lightly on the clutch. And he listened. He had been listening to the sound of cables under load for 54 years. He knew the sound of a cable about to part. He knew the sound of a cable that was holding. He knew the sound of a cable that was pulling against something that was beginning to give. The cable on the Mac was making the third of those sounds. Just barely. Just enough. At 7:08 in the evening, the frame of the truck shifted by perhaps half an inch. Walter felt it through the seat before he saw it. The left front wheel had been resting hard against the cribbing on the down side of the pull, and the wheel was now pressing into the cribbing with a force that flexed the oak. The boom above the cab was creaking on each second of held tension, and the creak was changing pitch. The angle of pull was working. The crane in the water somewhere out beyond the headlights was beginning to feel the lift. David stood at the open cab door with his hand on the frame. He said, "Pa, watch the boom collar." Walter said, "I am watching it." The boom collar was the welded ring at the base of the cantilever mast, where the mast met the bed frame of the truck. Eli had welded it on a Sunday morning in May of 1948, in 2 passes with electrodes he had carried home from American shipbuilding in his coat pocket the previous Friday. The collar had carried every pull this truck had ever made. Walter watched it now in the side mirror by the light of Jake Mooney's high beams, and he could see very faintly that the steel was holding the way steel holds when it is asked to do a thing it was built for. At 7:11, the sound came up from the lake. It was not loud. A man standing 50 feet away would have missed it. It was a single, deep, wet pop, the sound of suction breaking in mud, the sound of a buried steel boom releasing the lake bottom that had held it for 6 days. Walter heard it. He did not look at the lake. He did not need to. He kept his hand on the throttle and listened for the cable. The cable changed pitch. It dropped a quarter tone the way a violin string drops when a tuning peg slips, and then it settled at the new pitch, and it held there. Walter knew what had happened. The crane had broken free of the mud. The full weight of it was now hanging on the cable held against the boom geometry of the Mac, anchored through the head sheave and the snatch blocks to the frame of the truck, and below the truck through the cribbing to the buried foundation of the No. 3 slipway that Eli Brennan had helped pour 79 years before. The line of force ran from a 140-ton crane through 54 years of welded steel into a foundation that Walter's father had laid as a young man. And the line held. Walter increased the throttle by 50 revolutions per minute. The drum on the back of the truck turned a quarter inch. The cable came in a quarter inch. He waited. The drum turned another quarter inch. Another quarter inch. He held it there. He was not trying to pull the crane fast. He was trying to convince the crane to move at all. The mud at the bottom of the lake was reluctant to release what it had taken, and the slower the pull, the more cooperatively the mud would give it up. Walter Brennan had learned this lesson from his father in the autumn of 1963 on a recovery off the Cleveland breakwall at East 55th Street, pulling a sunken tugboat out of a slip. Eli had been 56 years old then. Walter had been 36. Eli had stood at the driver's door of the same truck Walter was now sitting in the same cold, and had said to his son the words that Walter had remembered every day since. Eli had said, "Son, you do not pull a thing out of water. You ask water to let it go." Walter sat in the cab and asked the lake to let it go. At 7:17, the second pop came, larger this time. A wet, heavy thud felt through the break wall under the boots of the men standing on it, and a small dark wave of disturbed lake bottom rolled to the surface 40 feet out and spread in a slow ring. Jake Mooney saw the ring expand into the edge of his headlight beam. He whispered something to himself that nobody heard. The cable jumped. It moved into the drum 8 inches in 2 seconds. Walter felt the lurch through the truck. The crane was free. He did not celebrate. He throttled back to 800 revolutions per minute and let the drum take up cable at its slowest pace. The crane was now moving through 18 feet of water and 4 feet of mud at a rate of about an inch every 5 seconds, which sounds slow until you remember that 140 tons does not need to move fast to make a difference. 140 tons only needs to move at all. The drum turned. The cable came in. At 7:24, the first piece of the crane's counterweight cleared the surface of the water and rose into the lower edge of the headlight beams. It looked in that light like the back of a whale breaking the surface in slow motion. The lake water sheeted off the dark green steel in long ropes. The crane's boom was still buried in the lake bottom and would not surface for another 15 minutes. But the counterweight was coming up first, because that was how Walter had set the angle of pull, lifting the heavy end and letting the light end pivot and follow. Frank Hollister was standing at the trailer steps with Vince Polchek beside him. Frank had not said a word in 20 minutes. Frank was watching the counterweight rise out of the water, and he was making in the quiet inside his own chest a calculation that had nothing to do with money. He was thinking about his sons. He was thinking about the 2 teenage boys in Akron who had not seen their father in 14 days, who did not yet know that he had moved into a ranch house on Detroit Avenue, who would that coming weekend be brought to the new house by their mother and would be told by Frank himself at the kitchen table that he was sorry and that he loved them and that the house was theirs to come to any time they wanted. Frank had been dreading the conversation for 3 months. He had been dreading it more than he had dreaded any conversation of his life. Standing at the trailer steps in the November dark with the counterweight of a sunken crane rising slowly into the headlights of 11 pickup trucks lined up behind a 1947 Mack Frank Hollister, suddenly knew that he was going to have the conversation, that he was going to be able to have it, that he was not going to lose everything that month. He did not know why he knew that. He just knew it. He turned to Vince Polchek and said quietly, "Vince, who is that old man?" Vince said, "That is Walter Brennan." Frank said, "No. I mean, who is he?" Vince looked at Frank for a moment in the dark. Vince said, "He is the son of a man who never charged $1. He was not owed. That is all you need to know, Frank." Frank nodded. At 7:31, the crane's main body broke the surface of the lake. The cable lifted it on a long, shallow diagonal, the boom still trailing in the mud. The counterweight up high, the whole assembly tilted at about 20 degrees off vertical. It looked impossible. It looked the way a thing looks when you have stopped believing it is going to happen and then it happens anyway. A young iron worker named Mike Sturgill, 24 years old, standing beside his Dodge pickup, said the words, "Holy God," under his breath, and his hand went up to his mouth before he knew he was doing it. The cable came in. The drum turned. The crane slid up the slope of the lake bottom, out of the water entirely, now dripping mud and lake silt and the long pale weeds of Lake Erie's autumn bottom. The boom emerged last like a tree being pulled up by its root. The full assembly of the crane, all 140 tons of it, came up onto the breakwall apron at an angle of about 15 degrees, settled gradually toward upright as the cable lifted, and at 7:41 in the evening, with the headlights of 11 pickup trucks burning across the gravel, the recovery crane sat on dry concrete for the first time in 6 days, mud sloughing off its frame, water streaming from 100 crevices, the lake giving up what it had taken. Walter Brennan shut the winch down. He set the parking brake. He sat in the cab for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. The men outside did not cheer. They did not clap. They stood by their trucks in the cold, and they looked at the crane on the breakwall, and they looked at the Mac, and they looked at the old man sitting in the cab of the Mac, and they did not say a word. The silence lasted 23 seconds. Walter counted without meaning to count. He had been a Navy gunnery rating in 1945, and he had learned to count seconds in his head, the way a man learns to breathe. He counted 23 full seconds of silence before Jake Mooney at the far end of the line reached into the cab of his Ranger and turned the headlights off. One by one, in the order the trucks had arrived, the headlights went out. When the last set of lights went dark, only the work lamps over the trailer were burning, and the moon, 3/4 full, had come up over the lake behind the breakwall and was lighting the side of the recovered crane in pale silver. Walter climbed down from the cab. He stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe of the truck. David stepped forward and put a hand on his father's shoulder and held it there for the length of one breath, and then let go. Frank Hollister walked across the apron to the Mac. He stopped about 4 feet from Walter. He did not extend his hand. He stood for a long moment looking at the older man and at the truck behind him, and then at the crane on the breakwall. He said, "Mr. Brennan." Walter said, "Son." Frank reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and brought out a folded white envelope. The envelope was thick. He held it in both hands, the way a man holds a thing he has been carrying in case he needed it. Frank said, "Mr. Brennan, I have $5,000 cash here. It is mine. It is not the company's. The company will pay you what we agreed when the paperwork clears. This is from me, for what you and your son did tonight. I would be honored if you would take it." Walter looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. He said, "Son, I want you to put that envelope back in your pocket." Frank said, "Mr. Brennan." Walter said, "Son, listen to me a moment." He took a step forward. He set his right hand gently on Frank's left shoulder. He was a head shorter than Frank. He looked up into Frank's face in the moonlight. He said, "Mr. Hollister, my father pulled a refrigerated truck out of this lake on the 14th of March, 1965. The driver of the truck was 22 years old. His name was Stanley Hollister. He had just delivered a load of beef to the loading dock at the American Shipbuilding Yard at Lorraine. He turned wrong on a frozen access road and went through thin ice off Beaver Park. My father pulled him out. The young man asked my father what he owed him. My father told him that he owed him nothing. The young man said he would buy my father a beer someday. He never did. My father wrote his name down in a book so that he would remember." Frank was very still. Walter said, "Son, your father was a good man. I never met him, but I know he was a good man because my father wrote his name down. And he wrote down that your father said his pa had fought in the Pacific. Your grandfather fought in the Pacific. So did I. So did my father." There are debts in this world, son, that do not get paid with money. They get paid by being there when the other man's son needs help. That is the only kind of debt my father ever recognized as real. And I will not take $5,000 from the son of a man my father pulled out of a lake. I will not take it. Put it back in your pocket. Buy your boys something they need. That is what I want done with that money. Frank Hollister did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the envelope in his hands. He looked at Walter Brennan. He said, "Mr. Brennan, I did not know." Walter said, "I know you did not know. You were not supposed to know. Your father did not tell you. My father did not tell me until I read his book last night. There are some things a man does not pass down, son, not because he wants to hide them, because he knows they are not his to talk about. They belong to the other man." Frank stood with the envelope in his hands. He folded it slowly. He put it back inside his coat. He extended his hand. Walter took it. They held the handshake for the length of 3 breaths. Frank said, "Mr. Brennan, I would like to come by the house some Sunday. I would like to see the bench, the one you painted for your wife." Walter said, "Son, you would be welcome." Frank let go of his hand. Walter turned and walked to the Mac. He stopped halfway. He turned back. He looked across the apron at Brad Kessler, who was standing alone at his Escalade 20 yards back, with the engineers and the safety consultant and the young woman with the camera now gathered behind him in a small, loose group. Walter walked over to Brad. Brad watched him come. When Walter was about 6 feet from Brad, he stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not point. He did not make any gesture that the camera could capture as drama. He said, "Mr. Kessler." Brad said, "Mr. Brennan." Walter said, "That is a fine vehicle you have." Brad said, "Thank you." Walter said, "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I am saying it. I do not have anything against you personally. I do not know you. You do not know me. But you stood here today and you told a young woman with a camera that this would not work. And you watched a man younger than you turn off the lights on a working job site to make sure of it. And I want you to understand something about that." Brad did not speak. Walter said, "Son, my father built this truck in a garage in Lorraine in 1947. He built it because the men who worked the steel and the men who worked the boats and the men who worked the railroads in this part of the country could not afford the kind of recovery that big companies like yours sold. My father built the truck for them. He did not get rich. He did not get famous. He died in a chair in his kitchen in 1979 with $8,400 in the bank. But the men he pulled out of trouble in 50 years of work, those men are buried in cemeteries all across northern Ohio. And every one of them got home to their families because my father did not turn his head when he saw a man in a hard place." Brad's jaw moved once. Walter said, "You can go on doing what you do. That is not my business. But you should know that the only reason that crane is sitting on this breakwall tonight is that my father built a truck in a garage in 1947. For the day a man like you would say, 'It could not be done.' He built it for this day, son. He just did not know which day it was going to be." Walter looked at Brad for one more moment. He said, "Drive home careful tonight, Mr. Kessler." He turned and walked back to the Mac. He climbed into the cab. David climbed into the passenger seat. The Mac started on the first turn of the key. Walter put the truck into low gear. and rolled it slowly off the apron, past the trailer, past the line of pickup trucks whose drivers stood now beside their open cab doors and watched him go past. Frank Hollister at the trailer steps, past Vince Polchek, leaning against the front fender of his Chevy with his arms crossed and his eyes wet out through the gate at 6 miles an hour onto the gravel approach road, onto Lake Road headed west. The Mack rolled through the dark toward Lorain at the same 28 miles an hour. Walter had driven it for 52 years. David did not speak for the first 10 miles. When he finally did, he said, "Pa." Walter said, "Son." David said Ma would have wanted you to do it. Walter drove for another mile before he answered. He said, "Son, I know." That was all either of them said the rest of the way home. Walter parked the Mack in the garage at 10:47. He shut off the engine. He sat in the cab for a moment. He climbed down. He pulled the canvas tarp back over the truck slowly with David helping at the other end. They tied the corner ropes. They turned off the bare bulb. They closed the wooden swing outdoors and dropped the bar across them. Walter went inside. He put the percolator on. He made coffee for the second time that day. He poured 2 cups. He set one across from him at the kitchen table at Margaret's place. David sat down in front of the cup. They drank their coffee in the kitchen at the table by the window that looked out at the garage. Neither one of them said a word for almost half an hour. When David finally went to bed in his old room at the back of the house, in a bed his mother had made up for him at Christmas of 1996, and had not been slept in since Walter washed the cups and went out to the screen porch and sat in the old wooden rocker and watched the moon move slowly across the November sky over Lake Erie. He did not sleep that night. He did not need to. The next morning, David drove back to Columbus. Walter stood in the driveway and watched the F-150 pull away, and he waved once and David waved back, and the truck turned the corner at Sycamore and 28th Street and was gone. Walter went out to the garage. He sat in the cab of the Mack for a long time with the leather notebook open on his lap. He turned to a blank page near the back. He took a pencil out of the small tin can on the dash. He wrote 2 entries. He wrote the date November 13th, 2001. He wrote Hollister Boy. Crane in the lake, pulled with primary anchor on the old number 3 foundation. Pa was right. Pa was right about all of it. He wrote the second entry below the first. He wrote Margaret. I am sorry, sweetheart. I had to. It was Stanley Hollister's boy. Pa never told me. I had to find out for myself. You would have understood. You always understood. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the workbench drawer. He pulled the canvas tarp tight over the truck. He went inside. Now, let me tell you what came after, because the story does not end at the kitchen table on the morning after the lake. Frank Hollister kept his job. The general contractor finished the port project 3 weeks late, but inside the contingency window of the contract. Frank received a written commendation from the company's CEO in February of 2002. He kept the ranch house on Detroit Avenue. He brought his 2 sons there for the first time, on the weekend after Thanksgiving. He sat with them at the kitchen table, and he told them the truth about the divorce, about the house, about the money, and about everything else he had been carrying. The boys cried. Frank cried. They went out to dinner afterwards at the Big Boy on Detroit Avenue and ate hamburgers and split a milkshake. The older boy, Michael, who was 16, asked his father that night who Walter Brennan was, because he had heard his father say the name twice during the conversation. Frank told him the story. Michael listened without interrupting. At the end of the story, Michael said, "Only that is a good man, Dad." Frank said yes, he is. Brad Kessler did not survive the next 2 years. The marketing video Apex had planned to release in December of 2001 was never produced. The young woman with the camera had been filming the entire pull from the moment Walter arrived at 6:41 in the morning to the moment the Mac rolled out the gate at 9:15 at night. And the footage she had captured was not the footage Brad had wanted. The footage showed the recovery crane sinking its outriggers into soft fill. It showed Brad laughing into the camera when the Mac's wheel lifted. It showed Brad ordering the sight lights shut down. It showed 11 pickup trucks turning their headlights on in the dark. It showed an old man and his son completing a pull that Brad had said was impossible. The young woman with the camera was named Allison Ferraro. She was 27 years old, a graduate of Kent State University, and she had been working for Apex for 2 years. After she went home that night, she sat in her apartment in Lakewood and she watched the footage 3 times. And then she did something Brad Kessler did not know she was gonna do. She made a digital copy of every minute of the footage, 11 hours total on 3 separate hard drives. She backed one of the hard drives up to her parents' house in Stowe. The next morning she came to work and she handed Brad her resignation letter. She did not give him the footage. She kept it. 6 months later, in May of 2002, Allison Ferraro sent a 100-minute edited version of the footage to a producer at the History Channel in New York, who was developing a series about American craftsmanship and forgotten trades. The producer called her back within 48 hours. The History Channel sent a crew to Lorraine in August. They spent 4 days with Walter Brennan in his garage and at the kitchen table and on the screen porch. The episode aired in February of 2003. It was called The Last Wrecker. It was watched by an estimated 3.2 million households on the first airing. Apex Heavy Recovery lost the port contract in February of 2002. They lost the Cleveland Steel Mill contract in April. They lost the Lake County Bridge contract in July. By October, Brad Kessler had been removed as CEO by the company's board, which was now controlled by his father's surviving business partner. By March of 2003, after the History Channel episode aired, Apex had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. By August of 2003, Apex Heavy Recovery was sold for parts to a regional equipment company out of Cincinnati. In June of 2003, Brad Kessler mailed a single envelope to Walter Brennan in Lorraine. The envelope contained one item, a photograph. The photograph was black and white. It showed a man in his late 20s standing at the edge of a body of water in a suit, smiling at the camera. On the back of the photograph in faded blue ink was written the name Howard Kessler, with a date June of 1967. There was no letter, no note, no return address, just the photograph. Walter Brennan looked at the photograph for a long time at his kitchen table. He did not know who Howard Kessler was. He turned the photograph over twice. He set it down. He took it out to the burn barrel in the backyard. He laid it on top of the small fire he had going for the yard waste. He watched the photograph curl and brown and turn to ash. He went back inside. He did not tell David. He did not write it in the book. He said to himself in the kitchen by the window the words his father had said to him in 1963. He said, "Son, some debts are not ours to collect." Walter Brennan ran the Mac 7 more times between 2001 and 2007. He pulled a cement mixer out of a quarry pond in Ashtabula County in 2003. He pulled a school bus out of a ditch on County Road 8 in Avon Lake in 2007. The last pull the school bus took 6 hours and Walter was 80 years old. The bus had run off the road in an ice storm. There were 41 children on the bus. None of them were hurt. The driver, a woman named Joanne Sumter, sent Walter a card the following Christmas. The card had been signed by every one of the 41 children. Walter kept the card in the leather notebook. Walter Brennan died on the morning of the 7th of April, 2009. He was 82 years old. He died in his chair in the living room of the house on Sycamore Street. He had been listening to the radio. The notebook was open on his lap. He had been reading the entry from March of 1965, the Hollister entry, the one that started everything. David found him at 4 in the afternoon. David buried his father next to his mother at Calvary Cemetery, 2 miles east of the house. The concrete bench Walter had been painting on the day Frank Hollister came to the door. The bench Walter had been painting in the brown grass on a November Monday. In 2001, sat between the two graves. Now with both their names carved on the inside lip of the seat, where only a person sitting down could see them. David inherited the Mac. He did not sell it. He did not donate it. He did not move it from the garage. He drove from Columbus to Lorain on the 14th of March every year. He opened the garage doors. He pulled the canvas tarp off the truck. He started the engine. He sat in the cab for an hour with the engine idling, and he listened to it. Then he shut it off, pulled the tarp back, closed the doors, and drove home. He did this for 6 years. In the spring of 2015, David Brennan, then 59 years old, donated the Mac LMSW to the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. He donated it on one condition. The condition was that the truck remain operational. The condition was that the society agree in writing never to display the truck as a static exhibit. The society agreed. The Mac now sits in the Working Transportation Collection at the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum on East Boulevard in Cleveland. Once a year, on the 14th of March, the society starts the engine and lets it idle for 1 hour in the museum yard. They open the yard to the public on that day. They have done it for 10 years now. The yard is always crowded. On the placard next to the truck, the museum has printed the following words: built by Eli Brennan, 1947 to 1949, Lorain, Ohio. Operated by his son, Walter Brennan, 1949 to 2007. Used in over 400 recoveries across northern Ohio. Never refused a call. Never charged a man who could not afford to pay. Last operated by Walter Brennan, age 80, in 2007. To pull a school bus carrying 41 children out of a ditch on County Road 8 in Avon Lake. Below those words in smaller letters is one additional line. The line reads, "The men of that generation did not build for tomorrow. They built for the day tomorrow would forget what it was supposed to know." That line was written by David Brennan. It is the only thing he ever wrote about his father. Eli Brennan built that truck in 1947 with $84 in the bank and a wife who was dying of tuberculosis and 2 children to feed. He welded the boom at night in a Lorain garage because he believed that a man who knew how to weld owed the world a thing he had made for nothing. He did not know when he set the angle of the cantilever boom against the foundation of the number 3 slipway on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1948 that he was building a tool for the day. A 140-ton crane would sit half submerged in Lake Erie 53 years later, with a 74-year-old son in the driver's seat and a 45-year-old grandson at the open cab door, and 11 pickup trucks with their headlights burning behind them in the dark. He did not know. He built it anyway. That is what the men of his generation did. That is what they were for. That is still what we are for.